Now, we spent all last week on a very small but difficult section of the Bible, the bronze serpent on the pole. And I'm not going to review it with you today because it's very complex. If you missed it, you want to go over it again, get it on CD, review it on the Torah class website. This week is going to be different. We're going to do more reading in one large block than maybe we've ever done. And that's because the story we're going to explore is important. It has many theological implications, and it covers 3 full chapters. And I don't like breaking up a story like this one because we lose continuity. We lose context. The entire serpent and the pole story covers only 6 verses in Numbers chapter 21, and it essentially interrupts the travel log of Israel as they leave Mount Hor to march by way of the Sea of Suf back to the south in order that they avoid conflict with the inhabitants of Edom. And as a reminder, this was some terribly difficult, dry, tortuous territory that they were traversing, and the weary Hebrews grumbled about this decision, which is what led to the divine plague of snake bites and then the cure, which was the serpent on the pole. So verse 10 then of chapter 21 picks back up their progress, now gaining momentum towards their destination. You know, after a 40-year journey, it must have been easy for those refugees to forget that the original goal was Canaan. They had been judged many times by God. Countless thousands had been killed. They had been attacked by nations, some who feared their approach, others just for the sake of trying to get plunder. Their staple diet for all these years had been one thing, manna, and they were tired of it. Simply obtaining water was an act of faith. It was a chore. Day-by-day living, surviving was first and foremost in their minds. All the challenges of life and bumps in the road of family disagreements and fractures in relationships were also part of their lives. Marriage, divorce, death, illness, injury, disputes with their neighbors. There's an old saying that Floridians are particularly familiar with that expresses the Israelites' mindset very well. When you're up to your rear end in alligators, it's easy to forget the original idea was to drain the swamp. But by now, there had been an almost complete turnover of the Hebrews' population as it had been led by Moses. The makeup of Israel in no way resembled the horde of city dwellers that had fled Pharaoh some 40 years earlier. Most of those over age 20 when they left Egypt were dead. They were buried out in the desert sand. Actually, their death was a precondition that the Lord had set for entering the Promised Land due to the Israelites' refusal to go forth and take the land. This was a result of the 12 spies incident. The majority population of Israel was now made up of those who had never lived in Egypt, had never even lived in a town or a village because they were born out in the wilderness, in a tent, during this arduous journey. The majority of Israel only knew the lifestyle of the Bedouin who lived as nomads. And keep this in mind as we move forward in the story of the conquest of Canaan. So let's reread Numbers chapter 21, starting at verse 10, and go to the end. Numbers chapter 21. We'll start at verse 10 and go to the end. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, this is on page 173. 173. Starting at verse 10. The people of Israel traveled on and camped at Avot. And from Avot they traveled and camped at Havarim in the desert fronting Moab on the east. And from there they traveled and camped at Wadi Zered. And from there they traveled and camped on the other side of the Arnon in the desert. This river comes out of the territory of the Amorites. For the Arnon is the boundary between Moab and the Amorites. This is why it says in the book of the wars of Adonai, Vahev at Sufa, the wadis of Arnon, and the slope of the wadis extending as far as the site of Ar, which lie next to the territory of Moab. From there they went on to Beer. This is the well about which Adonai said to Moses, assemble the people and I'll give them water. Then Israel sang this song. Spring up, O well, sing to the well, sunk by the princes, dug by the people's leaders with the scepter, with their staffs. From the desert they went to Mattanah, and from Mattanah to Nachliel, from Nachliel to Bamot, and from Bamot to the valley by the plain of Moab at the start of the Pisgah range, where it overlooks the desert. Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, with this message: "Let me pass through your land. We won't turn aside into fields or vineyards. We won't drink any water from the wells. We will go along the king's highway until we've left your territory." But Sihon would not allow Israel to pass through his territory. Instead, Sihon mustered all his people and went out into the desert to fight Israel. And on reaching Yahaz, he fought Israel. Israel defeated him by force of arms and took control of his land from the Arnon to the Yabok River, but only as far as the people of Ammon, because the territory of the people of Ammon was well defended. Israel took all these cities. Israel lived in the cities of the Amorites, in Heshbon, all its surrounding towns. Heshbon was the city of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and who had fought against the former king of Moab and conquered all his land up to the Arnon. This is why the storytellers say, "Come to Heshbon, let it be rebuilt, let Sihon's city be restored. For fire burst out of Heshbon. A flame came from the city of Sihon. A consumed Ar of Moab, the lords of Arnon's high places. Woe to you, Moab! You are destroyed, people of Chemosh. He let his sons be fugitives, his daughters captives of Sihon, king of the Amorites. We shot them down. Heshbon is destroyed, all the way to Dibon. We even laid waste to Nophach, which extends as far as Medeba." Thus Israel lived in the land of the Amorites. Moses sent men to reconnoiter Yatzer. They captured its towns. They drove out the Amorites who were there. Then they turned. They went up along the road to Bashan. And Og, the king of Bashan, marched out against them, he with all of his people, to fight at Edrei. Adonai said to Moses, "Don't be afraid of him, for I have handed him over to you with all his people and his land. You will treat him just as you did Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon." So they struck him down with all his sons and all his people until there was no one left alive, and then they took control of his land. We're going to move through this pretty rapidly so we don't get bogged down. Basically, the story picks up as the Israelites enter the area that is often called the Transjordan. It was really only known by that name during the 20th century, our 20th century. The territory more known as the modern-day Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Now, we're going to get somewhat of a recount of this in Deuteronomy, which offers some additional details, but the idea is that they tried quite hard to avoid conflicts with the peoples that had some distant connection with Abraham. People like the Moabites, the Ammonites, who were actually descended from Abraham's nephew, Lot. So we find Israel staying to the outer edges of the territory of Moab because they didn't want to stir up a problem, but that was almost unavoidable. There were too many Israelites to simply ignore their presence. And to the residents of the established territories and city-states of the Middle East, these 3 million Hebrews were little different than a horde of locusts descending on them. Well, verse 13 finds Israel now quite far north, well to the west of the Dead Sea. And the Arnon is a river that flows into the Dead Sea from the east. And the Arnon represents the southern boundary of Moab. Now, understand that just like in our day, geographic features like rivers and mountain ranges tend to be the points of demarcation of one nation, where one nation stops and another nation begins. But also understand that some territories tended to be more politically stable, others in constant flux. The land of Canaan was somewhat stable. The rulers of the area of Moab were constantly changing, and therefore so were their boundaries. This tended to make some areas easier to conquer than others. Areas that were more stable had large walled cities. Areas that were constantly changing hands tended to consist mostly of unprotected villages because it took years and sizable resources to build a strategically defensible city wall. Therefore, we find Israel willingly going into battle against the king of the Amorites, a fellow named Sihon, and then dispatching them. And the Israelites didn't intend on battling the Amorites. They preferred to simply pass through their territory so that they could cross the Jordan and enter Canaan. That's all they wanted. So as with the earlier story of the Israelites' encounter with Edom, Moses sends an emissary to King Sihon, asks for permission to pass with a promise not to make war, not to disturb the Amorites' field crops, they won't take water from the wells, and by the way, the agreement not to take water from their wells is not to be taken like you might think. The key word is take. There was no way Israel could avoid using the water from the wells owned by the Amorites. It's just that Moses was promising not to steal the water, not to take it by force or deception. Israel would openly tap the wells and justly compensate the king for whatever water they used. This is just the way of the various desert cultures of that era. But like with Edom, the king of the Amorites says no. Israel doesn't hesitate. They're not about to try to find another way into the land at this point. They're done with that. They're starting to feel their oats. And they know how close they are to their final destination, Canaan. So they got plenty of incentive to place their lives on the line and do battle. The result was that Israel essentially conquered the heart of the Transjordan region. And it was a wonderful land. It was fertile, aesthetically pleasing to look at. Israel killed many Amorites. They took their towns and villages and they moved in. Heshbon was King Sihon's capital. Israel took that as well. It's important here to understand a couple of things that's going to matter quite a bit when we start studying later books of the Old Testament, such as the book of Judges. First is that the Amorites were not indigenous to the Transjordan. Their homeland was Mesopotamia, and they had come down from there and taken over the area where Moses and Israel were journeying through. Second of all is that they essentially conquered Moab. More specifically, they established a king-vassal relationship with Moab such that Moab bowed down to Sihon of the Amorites. So Moab belonged to the Amorites and no longer was an independent sovereign nation. And we also find that while the nation of Ammon lay to the north and the east of Moab, it too was affected by the presence of the Amorites. Some number of the Amorite population had created villages outside of Ammon proper in an area near to the Jordan River. The Amorites conquered that area and to a lesser degree subjugated Ammon proper. Thus, when Moses and Israel defeated the king, Sihon of the Amorites, standard protocol of the day, meant that whatever and whoever King Sihon controlled now got transferred to Israel. Bottom line, even though Israel won Moab's territory, it was seen as being won from the Amorites who governed over Moab, which is not the same thing as Israel conquering Moab. Now, a good analogy of that would be if some foreign power attacked and conquered the United States, the people of the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico would also come under the control of that conqueror, even though realistically the conqueror never attacked and conquered Puerto Rico. That's just the way it works. Now, I think I can say with certainty that up to this point there had been no real thought by Israel of occupying land to the east of the Jordan River. This land wasn't Canaan. It had never been Canaan. And what God had promised to Abraham was Canaan. And since up to now the land promised to the Hebrews had only been identified as Canaan, meaning to the Israelites, the land on the west side, the west bank of the Jordan River, this seemed like an unexpected bonus. But because Sihon of the Amorites forced the issue and attacked Israel, Israel suddenly found itself as holders of much territory on the east side of the Jordan. Later on in Numbers, we will read of the historical dividing up of territory, tribe by tribe, with Moses overseeing the tribal territorial allotments. And we'll find that the two Israelite tribes and about half of another one are given territory right where we find the Israelites here in Numbers 21. And notice that verse 25 explains that Israel simply took all these towns of the Transjordan. Not that they took these towns, they actually settled in them. They didn't just take them, they made them their homes. And how can you blame them? It sure must have looked good to those Hebrews who were children or teens when they fled when they fled Egypt. I mean, it's no wonder that about a quarter of these road-weary Israelites decided they weren't going to continue on into the Promised Land. They were going to remain right there on that land, on the east side of the Jordan River. Land that Israel had conquered with relative ease from the Amorites because the enemy's numbers were relatively small and their villages were not walled. Next, Israel moved on a little further towards a place called Bashan. And of course, Bashan hoped to avoid what had happened to its neighbors. Apparently, before deciding whether or not to take on Bashan, Moses consulted with God, and God told Moses, go ahead and conquer them. That in fact, the Lord had already decided the outcome. The territory of Bashan extended all the way north to Mount Hermon, east to the King's Highway, west to the hills on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, and south to a line a little bit below the Jabbok River. The Jabbok was that place where about 5 centuries earlier, Jacob had reconciled with his twin brother Esau. So before the Israelites had even entered Canaan, their destination, they acquired a large area of land, and some of them settled in it. And that area was primarily what is now, today, the modern Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, located on the east side of the Jordan River. So I would say that the current regime controlling Jordan is quite wise to try to make and retain peace with Israel, because the Israelites occupied it a long time before the Ishmaelite Arabs ever did. And the Bible says that the Lord sees that land as belonging to Israel. When we look at later Bible passages, we find that what was promised to Abraham as a promised land actually expands in Ezekiel to include the Transjordan. Now, one can stand at the crossroads near Jericho, coming down from Jerusalem, where the road to Qumran and Masada intersects, and look across the northern end of the Dead Sea and actually see the land with the naked eye on the east side of the Jordan that Israel conquered. And it's also generally the area where Israel would eventually cross over into Canaan. Well, let's move on now to Numbers chapter 22 and the famous biblical story of Balaam and Balak. And the story of Balaam and Balak is long. It covers 3 chapters. And in order that we get the best overall picture, we're going to read it all the way through. We're not going to break it up in pieces. So, settle back, open your Bibles, and we're going to read chapters 22, 23, and 24 fully. Page 175 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. Here we go. Then the people of Israel traveled on and camped in the plains of Moab beyond the Jordan River opposite Jericho. Now Balak the son of Zippor saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was very afraid of the people because they were so many of them. Moab was overcome with dread because of the people of Israel. So Moab said to the leaders of Midian, "This horde will lick up everything around us the way an ox licks up grass in the field." Balak the son of Zippor was king of Moab at the time, and he sent messengers to Balaam the son of Beor at Petor by the Euphrates River in his native land to tell him, "Listen, a people has come out of Egypt, spread all over the land, and settled down next to me. Therefore, please come and curse this people for me, because they're stronger than I am. Maybe I'll be able to strike them down and drive them out of the land. For I know that whomever you bless is in fact blessed, and whomever you curse is in fact cursed." The leaders of Moab and Midian left, taking with them the payment for divining, came to Balaam and spoke to him with the words of Balak. And he said to him, "Stay here tonight, and I will bring you back whatever answer Adonai tells me." So the princes of Moab stayed with Balaam. God came to Balaam and said, "Who are these men with you?" And Balaam said to God, "Balak the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent me this message. The people who came out of Egypt have spread over the land. Now, come and curse them for me. Maybe I'll be able to fight against them and drive them out." God answered Balaam, "You're not to go with them. You're not to curse the people because they are blessed." Balaam got up in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, "Return to your own land, because Adonai refuses to give me permission to go with you." The princes of Moab got up and returned to Balak and said, "Balaam refuses to come with us." And Balak again sent princes, more of them, higher status than the first group. And they went to Balaam and said to him, "Here's what Balak the son of Zippor says. Please don't let anything keep you from coming to me. I will reward you very well, and whatever you say to me I'll do. So please come, curse this people for me." Balaam answered the servants of Balak, "Even if Balak were to give me his palace filled with silver and gold, I can't go beyond the word of Adonai, my God, to do anything great or small. Now please, you too, stay here tonight, so that I might find out what else Adonai will say to me." God came to Balaam during the night and said to him, "If the men have come to summon you, get up and go with them, but do only what I tell you." So Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, went with the princes of Moab. But God's anger flared up because he went, and the angel of God stationed himself on the path to bar his way. He was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. And the donkey saw the angel of Adonai standing on the road, drawn sword in hand. So the donkey turned off the road into the field, and Balaam had to beat the donkey to get it back on the road. And then the angel of Adonai stood on the road where it became narrow as it passed among the vineyards and had stone walls on both sides. And the donkey saw the angel of Adonai and pushed up against the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against the wall. So he again beat it. The angel of Adonai moved ahead and stood in place so tight that there was no room to turn either right or left. Again, the donkey saw the angel of Adonai and lay down under Balaam, which made him so angry that he hit the donkey with his stick. But Adonai enabled the donkey to speak, and it said to Balaam, "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" And Balaam said to the donkey, "It's because you've been making a fool out of me. I wish I had a sword in my hand. I'd kill you on the spot." And the donkey said to Balaam, "I'm your donkey, right? You've ridden me all your life, right? Have I ever treated you like this before?" "No," he admitted. And then Adonai opened Balaam's eyes so that he could see the angel of Adonai standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed his head and fell on his face. The angel of Adonai said to him, "Why did you hit your donkey 3 times like that? I have come out here to bar your way because you are rushing to oppose me. The donkey saw me and turned aside these 3 times, and indeed if she hadn't turned away from me, I would have killed you by now and saved it alive." Balaam said to the angel of Adonai, "I've sinned. I didn't know that you were standing on the road to block me. Now therefore, if what I'm doing displeases you, I'll go back." But the angel of Adonai said to Balaam, "No, go on with the men, but you are to say only what I tell you to say." So Balaam went along with the princes of Balak. When Balak heard that Balaam had come, he went out to meet him in the city of Moab at the Arnon border, in the farthest reaches of the territory. And Balak said to Balaam, "I sent more than once to summon you. Why didn't you come to me? Didn't you think I'd pay you enough?" And Balaam replied to Balak, "Here, I've come to you, but I have no power of my own to say anything. The word that God puts in my mouth is what I will say." Balaam went with Balak. And when they arrived at Kiryat Hutzot, Balak sacrificed cattle and sheep and then sent to Balaam and the princes with him. And in the morning, Balak took Balaam, brought him to the high places of Baal, and from there he could see a portion of the people. Chapter 23. Balaam said to Balak, "Build me 7 altars here and prepare me 7 bulls and 7 rams." Balak did as Balaam said, and then Balak and Balaam offered a bull and a ram on each altar. And Balaam said to Balak, "Stand by your burnt offering while I go off. Maybe Adonai will come and meet me, and whatever he shows me, I'll tell you." He went off to a bare hill. God met Balaam, who said to him, "I prepared the 7 altars and offered a bull and a ram on each altar." And then Adonai put a word in Balaam's mouth and said, "Go on back to Balak and speak as I tell you." He went back to him, and there, standing by his burnt offering, he, with all the princes of Moab, he made his pronouncement. "Balak, the king of Moab, brings me from Aram, from the eastern hills, saying, 'Come, curse Jacob for me. Come and denounce Israel.' How am I to curse those whom God has not cursed? How am I to denounce those whom Adonai has not denounced? From the top of the rocks I see them, from the hills I behold them, yes, a people that will dwell alone and not think of itself as one of the nations. Who's counted the dust of Jacob or numbered the ashes of Israel? May I die as the righteous die. May my end be like theirs." And Balak said to Balaam, "What have you done to me? To curse my enemies is why I brought you, and here you totally blessed them." And he answered, "Mustn't I take care to say just what Adonai puts in my mouth?" And Balak said to him, "All right, come with me to another place where you can see them. You will only see some of them, not all of them, but you can curse them for me from there." So he took them through the field of Zophim to the top of the Pisgah range, built 7 altars, and offered a bull and a ram on each altar. And Balaam said to Balak, "Stand here by your burnt offering while I go over there for a meeting." Adonai met Balaam, put a word in his mouth, and said, "Go back to Balak and speak as I tell you." He came to him. He stood by his burnt offering with all the princes of Moab, and Balak asked him, "What did Adonai say?" Then Balaam made his pronouncement. "Get up, Balak, and listen. Turn your ears to me, son of Zippor. God is not a human who lies or a mortal who changes his mind. When he says something, he will do it. When he makes a promise, he will fulfill it. Look, I'm ordered to bless. When he blesses, I can't reverse it. No one has seen guilt in Jacob or perceived perversity in Israel. Adonai, their God, is with them and acclaimed as king among them. God who brought them out of Egypt gives them the strength of a wild ox. Thus one can't put a spell on Jacob. No magical work against Israel. It cannot be said of Jacob and Israel, what is this that God has done? Here is a people rising up like a lion. It's like a lion, he rears himself up. He will not lie down until he eats up the prey and drinks the blood of the slain. And Balak said to Balaam, obviously you won't curse them, but at least don't bless them. However, Balaam answered Balak, didn't I warn you I must do everything Adonai says? Balak said to Balaam, come, I will take you now to another place. Maybe it will please God for you to curse them for me from there. Balak took Balaam on the top of Peor, overlooking the desert. And Balaam said to Balak, build me 7 altars here and prepare me 7 bulls and 7 rams. Balak did as Balaam said, and he offered a bull and a ram on each altar. Chapter 24. When Balaam saw that it pleased Adonai to bless Israel, he didn't go, as at the other times, to make use of divination, but he looked out towards the desert. Balaam raised his eyes and saw Israel encamped, tribe by tribe. And then the Spirit of God came upon him, and he made his pronouncement. This is the speech of Balaam, son of Beor, the speech of a man whose eyes have been opened, the speech of him who hears God's words, who sees what Shaddai sees, who has fallen yet has open eyes. How lovely are your tents, Jacob, your encampments, Israel. They spread out like valleys, like gardens by the riverside, like succulent aloes, planted by Adonai, like cedar trees next to the water. Water will flow from their branches, their seed will have water aplenty. Their king will be higher than Agag, and his kingdom lifted high. God, who brought them out of Egypt, gives them the strength of a wild ox. They will devour the nations opposing them, break their bones, pierce them with their arrows. And when they lie down, they crouch like a lion or a lioness who dares to rouse it. Blessed be all who bless you. Cursed be all who curse you. Balak blazed with fury against Balaam. He struck his hands together and said to Balaam, I summoned you to curse my enemies, but here you've done nothing but bless them 3 times already. Now you had better escape to your own place. I had planned to reward you very well, but now Adonai has deprived you of payment. Balaam answered Balak, didn't I tell the messengers you sent me that even if Balak would give me his palace full of silver and gold, I could not of my own accord go beyond the word of Adonai to do either good or bad? That what Adonai said is what I'd say. But now that I'm going back to my own people, come, I will warn you what this people will do to your people in the Acharit Hayamim, the latter days. So he made his pronouncement. This is the speech of Balaam, son of Beor, the speech of the man whose eyes have been opened, the speech of him who hears God's words, who knows what Elyon knows, who sees what Shaddai sees, who has fallen yet has open eyes. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not soon. A star will step forth from Jacob. A scepter will arise from Israel to crush the corners of Moab and destroy all descendants of Shet. His enemies will be his possessions. Edom and Seir possessions. Israel will do valiantly. From Jacob will come someone who will rule, and he will destroy what is left of the city. He saw Amalek and made this pronouncement. First among nations was Amalek, but destruction will be its end. He saw the Canaan and made this pronouncement. Though your dwelling is firm, your nest set on rock, Cain will be wasted while captive to Asher. Finally, he made this pronouncement. Oh no, who can live when God does this? But ships will come from the coast of Kittim to subdue Asher and subdue Aver, and they too will come to destruction. Then Balaam got up, left, and returned to his home, and Balak too went his way. Quite a story. I think we can all readily see that the assignment of the title Numbers for this book was a poor one, because accounting records and censuses are the least of this book. And I ask you to understand that all the titles that Christians use for the various books of the Bible are contrived by men in one way or another. Not that there's anything wrong with that. They're not false. They weren't intended to deceive, nor are they ever likely to be more than just a way to identify a particular group of scriptures. But we must not be so naive or ignorant to not know at this point in our walk with God that there is nothing sacred nor God ordained about Bible book names, about where chapter divisions or verse numbers are. They were added well into the future from when the scriptures were written for no other reason than for it to be a tool for us to study and communicate. The Hebrews tended to use the first few words of a new book as its title. The Greeks tended to use a word that they thought expressed the overall purpose of the book, or as with the New Testament, who it was addressed to, or sometimes who the author was. Now, this story of Balaam and Balak has a lot more theological depth to it than appears on the surface. The Gentile Christian world mainly remembers this episode because of the talking donkey, with the message that if God can't get a man to do his bidding or speak his word, he'll use an animal. And truth be known, that's probably the least of what's being taught here. A reasonable first question to ask about this story is this an actual event, or is it a legendary Hebrew fable? I know that question probably instantly bothers some of you, that I would even dare to broach that as a possibility. So I'll answer it in a way that I hope will relieve you. Yeshua often taught by means of a literary device called parable. Now, were the parables of Christ true stories of actual happenings? Were there really 10 virgins dressed in white carrying their oil lamps around at nighttime? Were there really, or what about the story of the wheat and the tares? See, a parable is a truth or a principle that's explained using an illustration, a word story. Yeshua didn't invent the use of a parable. Parable was a standard literary device of that age. It was invented centuries earlier. The Bible makes liberal use of metaphors, and they are often meant to shock us. The illustrations did not have to be an actual event, although something similar might have occurred so that the people who were listening got the picture because they could identify with it. Now, often enough, the parables were so vague that even Yeshua's closest disciples thought that they were more like riddles. So if you find it challenging at times to understand Jesus' parables and you need a teacher to help explain them to you, don't despair. The very men who Yeshua mentored found them to be perplexing at times. Now, just because a parable is a story designed to embody a godly principle, but was not always the recounting of an actual event, that doesn't make it a lie or a fantasy. And we're going to find poetic license in the Bible, lots of it. We'll find exaggerations, hyperbole, to make a point. The Apostle Paul was a real champion of exaggeration. We'll find the recording of men making false statements. King David did it. We're going to see humans doing terrible things. We'll see men say something totally incorrect about the Lord. That's all part of how the Bible communicates absolute truth and light to us. Taking the Bible literally does not mean that we're to take exaggerations as though they weren't, nor metaphor as if they were direct analogy, nor are we to take a poem as though it was academic history, or history as though every event had a very deep spiritual meaning we're supposed to find. Very probably, the story of Balak and Balaam is an embellished story based on something that actually happened. It was a historical event that had been expanded and kind of fableized. There may have been a seer named Balaam, a king named Balak, and Balak might have actually been terribly concerned about this giant Israelite tsunami that was coming his way, and he wanted divine help to counter it. The main giveaway that is almost certainly at least part fable is this talking donkey. Secondarily is that the entire story seems to be a detour in the historical recounting of Israel's approach to the Promised Land. And thirdly, we see that this entire story was an insertion into the book of Numbers from a later date, and that was probably added to it in pieces. That said, just like the parables of Christ, what is being taught throughout this story is divine truth. Some of it is prophetic. Really, there is probably more theological meat condensed in this telling than in any other place in the Scriptures. And what we have in the story of Balaam and Balak is a Bible within a Bible, or Torah within a Torah. And because of that, we're going to look at it very closely. The theological legend begins with King Balak, king of Moab, which was a vassal nation being ruled by the Amorites. Now, Balak was worried about all these Israelites who were on his border. And it's interesting that we're told that Balak was the son of a fellow named Zippor, because it harkens back to Moses' wife's name, Zipporah. Yeah, it means the same thing. Zippor is the masculine, Zipporah is the feminine. It means bird. Now, how is it that Balak's father and Moses' wife could have the same name, especially since that name is only found in one particular culture, Midian culture? The question is pretty well answered for us in verse 7, because it says that the elders of Moab got together with the elders of Midian to see what to do about this Hebrew problem. In other words, there was a regional alliance being described here between Moab and Midian. And as happens right up into our day in tribal as well as royal societies, intermarriage and the adopting of certain elements of a hoped-for allies' culture and customs, particularly when it comes to adopting names, that's the usual route to cement an alliance. And as we saw some time ago, Zipporah, Moses' wife, was a Midianite. Zipporah was actually a pretty common Bedouin name. So what we can now readily see is that Balak's father had adopted a Midianite name, Zippor, to show his favor towards his ally, Midian. The Israelite army had mowed right through the Amorites. So the people of Moab knew they probably couldn't stop them with force of arms, though they undoubtedly were going to try. So what's the solution? Magic. We'll use magic to enhance our chances of victory. So they sought to hire what must have been a very well-known and highly regarded magician named Balaam. Now, key to understanding our story is that Balaam lived up in Mesopotamia. He was, of course, a Gentile. He was a renowned seer and diviner and sorcerer, and Balaam lived near the Euphrates River, only about 12 miles from Carchemish. This is an area that alternatively is known as Aram, which we today would call Syria. Yet in a land full of pagan gods and a fully developed mystery religion system, for some reason, Balaam seemed to know, or perhaps even had adopted, the God of Israel. How or why is not explained to us. But let us also remember that Abraham, who began as a Gentile, was also from Mesopotamia, and he rather easily accepted this God, Jehovah. We get no explanation as to why Abraham had no qualms about it. Now, it's interesting that Balaam's character is alternatively painted as evil and then righteous. And in some ways, there's a kind of neutrality, maybe an even-handedness regarding his sentiment towards his own culture and towards the people of Israel. Yet the very fact that he is called a prophet and a diviner, and that his sorcery was found so impressive and useful for Balak and his government, it attests to the pagan beliefs and rituals that Balaam must have practiced, and all the heathen gods that he also included in his worship. For our purposes, we might as well picture him running around with a pointy black hat and a magic wand. However, our story puts what Balaam did in quite a positive light. At least we see that he certainly knows and he respects Jehovah, and he's determined to some degree or another to obey him. But as we're going to see in later chapters and even in other books of the Bible, there was another side of Balaam, and it ultimately gets revealed. And in fact, Numbers 31 says that Balaam was killed by the Israelites. In Deuteronomy 21, we even find the idea that Balaam fully intended to curse the Israelites for the rather large sum of money that Balak and his coalition were offering him, and only God's intervention stopped him from doing it. It wasn't that Balaam was doing the right thing by blessing instead of cursing Israel. It's that he feared for his life if he went against Jehovah. Well, with all the biblical evidence in hand, we can say with some confidence that Balaam was just a hired gun, utterly ambivalent to right and wrong. Whatever he did so for his own benefit even if that benefit was just self-preservation. So what we have in Balaam is a Gentile who definitely, at least in our story, received inspiration from the God of Israel. This is such a strange thing. Here we have God redeeming and then guiding his now well-established nation of Hebrews, but then Jehovah turns around and communicates with a Gentile prophet who's not part of a set-apart people. Yet there's no good reason to assume that the Lord found special favor with Balaam. There's no reason to consider Balaam holy, nor righteous before Jehovah, nor that his allegiance was to the God of Israel. Let me repeat it. Keep in mind all throughout our investigation of these passages, Balaam was a Gentile, but he was hearing directly from God. So we got a lot to untangle here. Now let me take one step further and we're going to close for today. We don't have to take this incident with Balaam as a biblical anomaly. That is, this story involving a pagan prophet, what we would call today a false prophet, being inspired by God, and for that reason accurately telling the future in a particular case. This is not unique. So hear me. The Bible confirms, boy, this is important. The Bible confirms that a false prophet can be used of God and even allowed to make an accurate prediction in order for Jehovah to achieve his purposes. So while correctly foretelling the future, or speaking an inspired message from God, or demonstrating some other seemingly legitimate spiritual gift can indicate a genuine interaction with the Lord, doesn't necessarily indicate a right relationship with God. Nor does the Bible use inspiration as a surefire indicator of the holiness of that person. Deuteronomy 13 tells us that false prophets can at times accurately see the future. We find examples of this all throughout the Bible, even though King Saul continued to accurately prophesy, and he did. He was condemned by the Lord as a bad king that would lose his throne. Caiaphas prophesied about the death of Christ in John 11. Jewish sorcerers cast out demons using Yeshua's name, but they didn't trust in him as Messiah or Lord. The Corinthians, perhaps the greatest examples of church behavior gone wild, were said to have had many real, validated spiritual experiences, but they came up awful short on holiness, love, and any sound doctrine to speak of. This sort of phenomenon was common enough in Christ's time that in Matthew chapter 7, Yeshua warned that in the end times, driving out demons, ecstatic spiritual acts, the performing of miracles would happen. They would happen, and it would be real. No optical illusion. But these acts were not necessarily to be taken as signs proving that that person who did these things was guaranteed a place in heaven. Rather, it was only that heaven is only for those who do the will of my Father. So in both the Old and New Testaments, we have demonstrations and warnings that God's inspiration of a man to achieve a purpose is not a certain sign of that man's status with Jehovah. This in itself is a good reason to always be a healthy skeptic. Not of God, but of people who purport to speak for God. We're going to continue with this fascinating theological story of Balaam and Balak next week. Please rise.